Yeah. Here I have a really, I don't know what kind of question this is. At least in the Pluhar translation, he throws out this word soul every now and then.
Yeah.
What the hell does that refer to?
He also uses the word
The
mind.
soul.
I mean, does it, I mean, sometimes it sounds like it's a synonym for transcendental ego, maybe, but
Oh,
But he
because
also uses the word mind.
he uses the word mind, but there, I mean, he talks about things like, is it like faculties of the soul?
Yeah.
So anyway,
Mind.
I
Yeah.
don't think that's probably not a huge question, but I was just like, what is that? And yeah, in mind, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I noticed that he used soul for the first time in the A edition, and then I didn't notice it in the B, but I could be wrong. So I'm not sure if he like ended up taking it out.
I haven't looked at the B part of this.
No, not like even earlier. When he
Hmm.
mentions soul, it's usually in the A edition.
yeah. I think he, in the B edition, tried to reduce that emphasis with I think there's accusations of not only the idealism, the Berkeley
Hmm.
Berkeley sort, but but also a kind of like psychologism that he was sort of mapping things out based off empirical psychology, and because of that, to try to get rid of those misunderstandings, then he tried to de-emphasize, I think, that aspect of like subjective faculties of the soul. Although I think it's still basically there, and that's what's going on. Is he's literally talking about the soul, and I think he's the mind, soul, mind,
Yeah.
psyche. Um,
What is that? I mean, I think I think of empirical ego and transcendental ego, but is the soul something different than one of those?
I don't think so. I think the soul basically is the transcendental. Um, okay, well the I'm not sure how to say this exactly. Because he's not going to talk about the transcendental ego exactly. At least not in terms of the transcendental unity of apperception, which that goes along with this kind of numerical identity of the self, and that I think is part of the self is also like the soul. And all these faculties he's talking about, they are faculties of the soul too. Um and this like later commentators and critics say, yeah, like the whole kind of emphasis on consciousness, even the kind of phenomenological sort of rendering of it is kind of like the last bastion of the old soul. It's kind of the same thing, um, but transformed into something a little more palatable to modernity, I guess. And Kant, I think, is right at the cusp of all these changes going on, where there's still kind of, yeah, an emphasis on soul, mind, and okay, so I think one thing that could be in conflict or an opposing idea would be something like, okay, like natural scientific materialism would say like, no, there's no soul. It's just your nervous system, something like that. And Kant obviously is very opposed to that thinking. So I think that's why it makes sense to think of it as like he is talking about the soul, the mind, the self, as opposed to those ideas of like a some kind of a empirical or material kind of formation of the self. Um, I don't know if that exactly answered your question of it, but that's my best attempt, I guess.
I would agree with most of that, except I think in the A section, when he's using soul, it's more in reference to an empirical observation of the self. That the transcendental ego is more of a logical kind of deduction or inference. It becomes an X, we know not what either. It just unifies things, right? So we can kind of almost extend this idea of soul as mind to the transcendental ego, but I don't think that's really what he's trying to do. He's more just all of this stuff that when we introspect, right? We have time as the form of inner sense, and like that's all just kind of introspection in the soul through time. All these inner states changing from one to another, and recognizing some continuity. Like first I was sad, and then I was more sad, and then I was angry, and then I hit Hunter.
So you're thinking it's more associated with the empirical ego or with empirical consciousness? Maybe I should
Right.
say that.
And when I read today's section in the Pluhar, it's all A, and from memory, these references to soul refer more to an empirical ego, to what we experience when we introspect.
So this is, I'm going to read just a few sentences. This is A111. It's the second paragraph in part 4, preliminary explanation of the possibility of the categories as a priori cognition. So the second paragraph at A111, a unity of synthesis according to empirical concepts would be entirely contingent. And if empirical concepts did not rest on a transcendental balance of unity, then it would be possible for our soul to be filled with a crowd of appearances that yet could never turn into experience. So that's the first place well, maybe I missed it, but that
That's
one
the
kind of
first one. Yeah, that's the
like,
first
where
one.
did that come from?
I think you could replace it with mind or consciousness.
Hmm.
I mean,
Without the,
I would say the same. I would read it in the same way. I think. I don't know.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
You know, okay, so that kind of gets into one of the questions that I had coming out of this, which was the transcendental unity of apperception. Is it individuated for people?
That's
Like, is
actually,
it do
yeah,
I have a transcendental unity of apperception that is just mine as a person, and then you have your own, and they're the same
that's a good question.
function, but like how do you get individuation from
I
that?
think
Or
I
do
think it
we
is.
have individuation? Or
Yeah, I wondered the same thing.
Yeah, I think it is individuated. I don't know where I
right.
got that idea, but
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, it's first, it's not something you have, right? That would treat it like a substance or a property, like some inert thing or whatever that's in you. It's a function,
yeah,
right? It's that which brings together all of your perceptions, and makes it a unified experience that you're having.
But this sort of Leibniz, what is that identity of indiscernibles thing sort of popped into my mind. If the transcendental subjectivity has exactly the same structure for every rational finite consciousness, I mean, if like that, I mean, that is the ground of objectivity, right? Is that transcendental subjectivity provides the same exact structure for every consciousness. Well, if that's the case, then why would we say there's more than one of them? I mean, couldn't it be the case that transcendental subjectivity, I mean, I'm almost like this almost Buddhist thing, like, isn't it possible that transcendental subjectivity is some kind of universal ground of consciousness, and that then each empirical individual taps into it, as it were, and that you have each empirical individual consciousnesses, each one is kind of tied back to this thing. Anyway, I don't, if every single one is exactly the same, has exactly the same structure, exactly the same functions, which it must have as it to be the ground for objectivity, then why say there's more than one?
Well,
And I mean, and even the word one, I mean, what does that even mean for something that's transcendental?
well,
I mean, it means because that unity, that the unity of transcendental perception, it provides the unity of my experience.
Right.
But that doesn't, but I don't, it seems like, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, that it would be then, that it would make any sense to then say, and there's one of those, because one of those seems to be something that you could apply to something in empirical consciousness. Can you, like for example, if you have unity, well, what unity does is it unifies experience, but I don't have experience of the transcendental subjectivity. It's the ground of it is
Right.
that which unifies, but does that mean it is itself a unitary? I mean, it's not a thing, right? So in what
No,
sense is it,
it's an activity. It's an
can,
activity of
yeah,
uniting all of your intuitions and concepts and experiences of objects together into a cohesive experience. And if we go to a concert, we're all going to have our own experience of the concert.
Yeah. Mhm.
that's right. But what I'm saying is, and maybe this is, again, if they're all exactly the same, why is it not possible that there is a transcendental subjectivity, a set of processes that are the universal transcendental ground for all individual empirical consciousnesses? But why must we, I mean, I don't even know what it would mean to individuate the transcendental subjectivity. I don't know how that even has meaning.
It comes into our analysis because we want to understand how we have a cohesive individual experience.
But I don't think that necessitates there being a transcendental subjectivity for every empirical individual.
Well,
Um,
if its function is to unify, and it was unifying everyone's experiences, then it seems like they would just everyone's experiences would be you would have access to each other's conscious
I don't
experience.
see why, because the purpose of transcendental subjectivity is to provide the founding structures for empirical experience. And it seems like, when you're talking about something that's transcendental, that is not anything you can have experience of anyway, there could be a set of processes that provide the structural processes for empirical experience, and for any number of empirical, because if what individuates may not be the transcendental subjectivity, but the empirical manifestation. And
that
so
sounds
in
like
what sense does it even make, because again, given that it's transcendental, I don't even know, how does it make sense to talk about my transcendental subjectivity? It's the ground of me being able to say mine, granted, but it's not my transcendental subjectivity.
Yeah. So how could that also goes into, so if it's a consciousness, that seems strange because you're not actually conscious of it. So like it's a consciousness that's not conscious. Like how can there even be a transcendental consciousness
Yeah,
that
I think
we're,
it talks about empirical consciousness and transcendental consciousness, right?
But does he ever say there's transcendental consciousness?
no,
No?
no, there's a synthetic unity of a perception, which is the ground for empirical consciousness.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I don't know if he talks about transcendental. It's like, that sounds like you're tapping in to some enlightened state, you
I
know?
don't mean that. I just mean it is like, lack of a better word, the metaphysical grounding, the like a field or something that is the
Well,
condition for the possible. I mean, I think of I don't know much about this. Like in quantum field theory, you've got these fields, and like in the electron field, an electron is an excitation in the electron field, and then you get an electron that appears in the empirical field. But the electron field is, I don't know, to use the sort of Deleuzian thing, it's almost like a virtual field that is the ground for the possibility of electrons as such. So there's one field, but then you have these manifestation of individual objects. And so, why couldn't transcendental subjectivity be something like that? The field, the ground of subjectivity, of empirical subjectivity, but that is again, I don't even know I don't understand what it would mean to say that transcendental subjectivity is individual. That doesn't make sense to me.
It's the function which individuates,
Right.
right? But we can't, I mean,
Yeah,
as far as giving it an ontological status, this is outside what
yeah.
the CPR is trying to do, right? We're not trying to give on any kind of ontological account.
Well,
But
Yeah.
I think,
um,
Nevin,
Yeah.
what you're saying would make sense if like the categories and everything that is transcendental were static, but it's not static. It's interacting in a way, like actively synthesizing something together, and what it's synthesizing, it's what is experience for me. So it has to be individuated, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll drop this. I don't think it does, but
I
like
just
Eric
found
said,
it.
we're probably talking about things we don't have
right,
a right to talk about.
I found a quotation page 169 that sort of hints at the fact. Well, he does use the term empirical consciousness, and he does hint at the fact that there are different individual consciousness. For instance, he says that he's talking about the unity of association. At the beginning, he says, and in case they were not associable, I mean, in case all the perceptions were not or didn't have a unity, there could be a multitude of perceptions, and presumable also an entire sensibility in which there would be much empirical consciousness to be found in my mind, yet found as separate and without belonging to a consciousness of myself. This, however, is impossible, for only by classing all perceptions with one consciousness, original perception, can I say, for all perceptions, that I am conscious of them. And he talks about one consciousness, and he talks about empirical consciousness. So I think, yeah, there are different consciousnesses,
Well, or you're saying there's at least different. Again, they're not.
different individuation of consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm not completely convinced, but
yeah,
but
because
I don't think it's a crucial issue.
so I mean,
I think it's important, but
right, for Kant, we start with the synthetic unity of intuition, right? So you perceive spatially and temporally from your perspective, not from the perspective of all of humanity, right? So and at any given moment, you're intuiting objects spatially or temporally from your finite perspective, and so is everybody else.
Right, but that locality could be an artifact of empirical conditions. Like I am at this particular place in this particular time, having these particular intuitions. So the ground of individuation could be those empirical conditions, not the transcendental. I mean, the
Right.
transcendental is the condition for the possibility of that.
yeah.
But if you want to speculate something like a world soul, right, or a
Right,
world transcendental
Yeah, that's
subjectivity, or the world as will, a
right.
singular will, then yeah, it's with you could argue this is within Kant's framework that you can go in that direction. Kant wouldn't approve, but it's allowable if you want to supplement with some kind of ontology. But he's avoiding this kind of
Hmm.
speculation.
Yeah. So maybe this is the kind of thought that maybe you end up with Schopenhauer. Maybe that's how Schopenhauer ends up, or maybe, that those sorts of thoughts. I don't know. I'm curious. I mean, I also we don't want to get into Hegel, but I'm curious as with regard to spirit being almost cosmological,
Mm,
if there's something of that there as well. But anyway,
yeah. I think that the use of the term transcendental in Kant is much more restricted than in all of the other philosophers. It's just something a priori. It's not cosmological or a soul, a universal soul, or something like that.
Right, exactly. It's purely a logical function doing a kind of epistemological labor.
Yeah.
yeah, and again, like you said, probably the sort of speculation I've doing or that we're doing, he would probably say is beyond the scope because you're trying to penetrate backwards as it was. You're trying to use those empirical categories to analyze something that's not empirical.
Right. That would be, yeah, trying to make a synthetic a priori judgment off of something which is never actually an object of experience. So it
Yeah.
would be outside of the bounds that Kant has laid down. But all of his biggest fans quickly broke those boundaries. You know,
Yeah.
On page 157, on the second paragraph, I just want to clarify that first sentence when he says, since that X, the object which corresponds to them, is to be something distinct from all of our presentations. This object is nothing for us. He's talking about the noumena, right? Like
the transcendental object.
yeah, the thing in itself.
Well, no, I don't think the
No.
transcendental. No, yeah, the thing in itself is the thing that we can't have any discussion of or knowledge of, or say anything particular. But there's no particular qualities that can be ascribed to it or judgments that can be made about it. But the transcendental object is just the like the it signifies nothing but the unity which must be encountered in cognition. That's and that unity that must be encountered in cognition is not to say like something, some sort of material like object in like the world that approaches our experience and then starts like emitting radiation of data into my, you know, my perception that I can apprehend. That's um I got a lot out of this what is it, A107 I think. I'm not sure. Or no, sorry, no, A109. Sorry, you're right. A109. That's that paragraph that starts at 109. The pure concept of transcendental object with is really always one in the, which in all of our cognitions is really always one and the same, X. So like the thing, there might be like a bunch of stuff that I see where you're coming from though. It's like splitting hairs a little bit. It's like, so like there could be a lot of objects in themselves out there doing whatever, but there is always one and the same X, the transcendental object. Actually, now this is I said this a little bit ago. I compared this to an idea like a week or some odd ago to be a little funny, but this is being less funny. There actually is an idea in, if anybody knows anything about Lacan at all, objet the signifier of a thing that's not an object, but a signifier for the object cause of desire. That sort of signifier of this sort of empty signifier. You know, like
Yeah.
like that signifies a gap or a chasm of some sort. For Lacan, I think is pretty clearly, and he himself kind of talked often about Kant and his preferential treatment of Kant's work over people like the later people like Hegel, who he had a distaste for, even though he whatever, you know. But yeah, that I think that this transcendental object X is something like that. You
Yeah,
know,
I was thinking the same thing. And I, oh, sorry. And I also thought that again we have this term transcendental, and I think if we take it in the sense that we were talking a moment ago, that is something restricted to a condition of perception and conceptualization. If it's a transcendental object, it's like a category that allows us to have concepts of empirical objects. That's why he says the transcendental object is non-empirical, because it's like a category, like a priori category that allows us to conceive of all of the other objects, something like that. So
Through
if
the
we,
categories.
huh?
Through the categories.
Yeah,
Yeah, I thought of it as, or what it seemed to me is it is just a sort of stand-in for the unity of the object. So um, when I like here's an empirical object, and the transcendental object is like a cognitive way of thinking of the unity of this object. Um, so I mean, I don't know. I initially thought, well, this is the thing in itself, but then I thought, but this transcendental object, the whole focus is on this. It is the sort of conceptual notion of the unity of the thing, and at least I hadn't thought of had thought of the thing in itself as being more like well, the way Eric has expressed it, it's like a boundary condition. It's when you're, kind of poking on the empirical features of something, it's that at which you cannot get. And so, they seem to be related, but at least maybe the different, well, like Eric said, maybe different senses or different emphasis, something like that.
Um, may I ask a question on page at the very bottom of page 160 in the Pluhar translation? It's right before subsection 4 on the preliminary explanation of the possibility of the categories as a priori cognitions. The last full sentence after the IE at the bottom of page 160, the transcendental law says, just as appearances must in mere intuition be subject to the formal conditions of space and time, so must appearances in experience be subject to conditions of the necessary unity. That's that phrase again, unity of perception. Indeed, this law says that through these conditions alone, remember, this is another time he says alone, alone does any cognition first become possible.
that's consciousness. The necessary unity of a perception.
So, so another way of saying unity of perception is consciousness.
I think so. He goes on later on. He explains that.
Yeah, he's
We
gonna
say that again. Would you repeat that, Luis?
Oh, the unity of a perception is consciousness.
Well, what I wonder, because there was a place in here where he talked, damn it, where he talked about consciousness. Let's see, this is way over in A119, on the section 3, the deduction of pure concepts. But he says, where is it? Let it no one A1 right at A120. Let us now show how the understanding by means of the categories coheres necessarily with appearances, and let us do so by starting from the bottom upward. I actually thought these next couple pages were really helpful, but namely from the empirical. What is first given to us is appearance. When appearance is combined with consciousness, it's called perception. And the first thing that popped into my mind is, what the hell is an appearance without consciousness? I mean, so you've got an appearance, and then you have an appearance with consciousness, which becomes perception. And so what I was wondering, if maybe he's thinking that there might be, or maybe at least conceptually, a kind of awareness that lacks a perception, and maybe that awareness lacking a perception is where appearance would come in. But then what he thinks of as consciousness is always that kind of mental awareness with a perception. So that consciousness is not identical to a perception, but that a perception is what makes a certain kind of mental awareness consciousness. That consciousness is always includes this reference to mine.
An analogy I had to try to is because I had the same reaction you did, Never. Just like, wait a second, how can we have a sense of appearance if there's not a consciousness that is experiencing that appearance? But by analogy, I was thinking, have you ever heard of a song, music, and you obviously can hear the individual notes, but you don't know what the song is, and then all of a sudden in a second you go, oh, I know that song. That something coalesces, and it's like, oh yeah, I recognize that song now, but you didn't for the first how many number of notes.
But even it's possible to do such a thing, right? To hear a note, hear another note, recognize that those are coming from the same place and cohesively starting to give us an introduction to a song, right? In order for that to happen, you have to have a unified experience, right? You can't just have a disunified experience of hearing a note and then hearing another note, and there's no relationship at all between these notes, right? It's just bombardment of sensory things without anything holding them together as constant objects or related objects or changing objects.
You say, oh, go ahead, Nelson.
Thank you. I'm a little bit behind in reading, which is why I'm not saying much. So I apologize if this is like, if I'm missing something here that is affecting what I'm saying. But I did write down earlier from B69, like way earlier in the book, because I'm just trying to write down anytime he says something that could be sort of a definition of a word. He referred to apperception as the consciousness of oneself. So that, I guess, had me under the impression that like consciousness outside of Kantian terms would just be something like what I would think of as consciousness, and that maybe apperception was more like meta consciousness or like metacognition in terms of like, as far as like, I'm aware of myself, like I'm aware of this thing, and then I'm also aware that I am myself looking at this thing. Again, I could be missing stuff because I'm not caught up.
Yeah, so apperception, it has a kind of philosophical history, which means basically self-consciousness or consciousness of consciousness. That's how Leibniz talks about it. So yeah, I think that's right.
Right. And it's key in the Kantian system that we leverage here self-consciousness as such and not just consciousness, because this is what allows the understanding to be modified by reason, and moreover allows an individual to engage in a kind of self-development as a practice of freedom. Without self-consciousness, Kant thinks, and many Enlightenment philosophers think, that without self-consciousness as such, we can't attain freedom.
Yeah.
But wouldn't he say, I mean, the sense I got in all of this stuff is that and I don't know how this came up with a discussion about Hegel with Hunter one time, and it seemed like it was the same kind of a thing, but that my ability to experience this as a unified object is ultimately grounded in my own transcendental apperception. In other words, it sounds like the unity of transcendental apperception is the condition for the possibility of experiencing the unity of other things. Is that not correct?
Right.
Yeah. So
for creatures like us, right? We could talk about animals having not exactly a human understanding, not a self-consciousness, but still perceiving stable objects over time, right? But for our human understanding, self-consciousness is key for this understanding, because this form of understanding is amenable to a kind of interplay with judgment and reason.
So non-apperceptive consciousness might be able to experience objects, unified objects in some way, but it wouldn't be the way we do.
Right. It wouldn't be amenable to reason, and it wouldn't have the possibility of freedom or the moral law.
So the way I experience the unity of objects is, I don't know if dependence the right word, but the transcendental unity of a perception is a condition for me to experience the unity of objects and the unity of temporal succession and all those other the unity of the imagination as it works on stuff.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think a section that is very important regarding what we're discussing is page 164A 115. So he explains that the relationship between sense, imagination, and apperception. So yeah, that's a very important section.
Agreed.
Yeah, he says pure apperception is the thoroughgoing identity of oneself in all possible presentations.
One thing I had difficulty was grasping the notion, again, I'll probably say it wrong, but imagination as a transcendental function. Because I think of Eric's body movement last week makes me think this is not quite right, or it is too simplistic to think of imagination. I was thinking of imagination as the image producing faculty, but it's different. I don't know what that means if in the case of transcendental or that however he puts it, the transcendental principle of imagination. I mean, does that just mean the ability to produce unified images in the empirical imagination? Or I'm having a hard time figuring out what the empirical versus the transcendental.
Transcendental is the category that allows you for the empirical imagination. It's something that precedes, it's always a priori. It's like a faculty that allows you to do the empirical imagination. Like if you want to imagine a Minotaur, that's empirical. The Minotaur is the empirical imagination. The faculty that allows you to do that, I would say, I mean, that's my opinion. The faculty that would be the transcendental imagination. I think, I don't know.
Right.
And so his argument is that the imagination, or part of what he's trying to argue in here is my empirical imagination can't. Part of his argument is to show that my empirical imagination has to have a transcendental ground.
Yeah. I agree, yeah.
Yeah, the transcendental function of imagination allows for the possibility of constant objects. The empirical imagination can play with those.
Yeah, of
And
association
Okay.
yeah.
association. Oh, by the way, Eric, I found the part where he does mention empirical consciousness and transcendental consciousness. And
Okay.
it's on Pluhar, page 165, and it's footnote 138 by Kant himself. And in that footnote, he talks about empirical consciousness.
That's right. That's right. It's quite a long footnote too.
Yeah.
Oh no, there it is.
Right.
What number is that?
138.
A?
It's
yeah.
right it's the very at A117, the very end of a paragraph, there is a footnote.
Oh, I see it.
One
Okay.
of Kant's own footnotes.
Right. I want to say that this is something that he kind of pulls back from a bit in the B edition.
Oh, yeah, maybe because
I mean, he does allow for some kind of awareness of oneself, but we have to be very careful that that awareness is not oneself as object.
Right. I mean, I think there he's with Hume when Hume says, I do not have an impression of a constant self. And I think Hume's agreeing with that. Yeah, you're right. But there's got to be a transcendental ground for this unity. If it may not be something that appears in your empirical experience, but there's got to be something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I think Kant would say, you're correct, Hume. In your field of experience, you're never going to see a stable self, but you must have a stable self in order to even pose the question to begin with.
Yeah.
So I think my point about a transcendental consciousness holds because of this footnote.
Mhm.
He
What was the
says
point?
transcendental consciousness.
Presentation.
So
Yeah, so I'm going to read that. At least this is how it goes in the Pluhar. We must not, however, ignore the fact that the mere presentation I, in reference to all other presentations whose collective unity makes it possible, is transcendental consciousness. Or to cut out all the intervening words, the mere presentation I is transcendental consciousness.
Right, but it has to be a bare eye, right? Insofar as when you put a name on it, when you start describing, I'm Nevitt, I'm a professor at Texas State,
Right.
then
Those are all empirical.
those are all empirical, right? So when we understand I, it's a purely logical function.
Yeah. I mean, but well, again, maybe it's not an important point, but so then is this transcendental consciousness just this sort of base awareness of,
Oneself as a self,
yeah,
and no more. As a stable and enduring self, but no more. Add descriptors, then we start getting empirical about it.
okay.
I still don't see why it has to be a consciousness or however he talks about it. It's kind of like you need a consciousness to ground your consciousness.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
still
This is where I think he's gonna change it a little bit in the language in the B edition.
it makes more sense to me. We're just saying that's like a logical function and kind of like a activity that's not a substance. That makes sense to me. But what doesn't make sense to me is to think of it as like an awareness or a consciousness, because I can only think of that as empirical.
Hmm. Yeah. I
I
mean,
don't
what
know,
I
maybe
was gonna,
that's my shortcoming, maybe to probably to some extent. But yeah, I don't know. I have a hard time getting around that because I'm just like, what? Where are you getting this from, Kant?
Very.
He seems to be taking kind of like, okay, empirical consciousness has this kind of unitary aspect to it, almost as like a kind of phenomenological general description. But then he's kind of like taking that general characteristic of empirical consciousness and saying, oh, that's also like then this transcendental condition of empirical consciousness, transcendental consciousness, which grounds that. So it's kind of like taking something from empirical consciousness and extrapolating it into the ground of itself.
Yeah, it's what
And it's
he does that like that with
Right.
everything. With
Right.
imagination, as we saw, he does that. He talks about empirical imagination, and then he says the ground for this is a transcendental imagination. And if he talks about consciousness, he says, well, the ground for empirical consciousness must be a transcendental consciousness. And if he talks about an object, he says, well, the ground for having object, for perceiving object, must be a transcendental object. I think he's obsessed with that.
Right.
yeah,
I think you can think of an analog too. I mean, we have empirical consciousness of time that seems to be prior to his speculation about a transcendental form of time, right? All knowledge comes from experience, or knowledge starts in experience, but it does not arise in experience. So we can have an empirical awareness of self. But what he wants to point out is this transcendental synthetic unity of a perception, which is like Mario put, like a pure I, right? Which is not what we immediately, for the most part, when we think about ourselves, we think about ourselves as angry or as engaged or as hungry. You know what I mean? But if we strip away, in the same way that if we strip away all of our little temporal sequences and our my reflecting on taking 5 minutes to eat cake, reflecting on taking 20 minutes to drive home. This is all kind of an empirical consciousness of time, which allows me, if I can do a transcendental analysis, to get towards a conception of time as a pure form, right? I think he wants us to do something similar with the self.
Does does Kant ever discuss it in the way that Fichte takes up this problem, where Fichte kind of specifically addresses this by talking about the idea of the pure I versus the pure I itself. And our idea of the pure I is just like us reflecting on this transcendental subject, and it's just an idea. Like we could never actually get at it.
He's gonna lay out some more. I promise there's gonna be more about this transcendental subjectivity, about the synthetic unity of a perception, and also questions about soul and any kind of endurance of a soul. Like we'll keep visiting these topics all the way through to the transcendental dialectic.
Okay, so when he talks about a unchanging self, a numerical identity, although I think the numerical identity is talking about that in terms of objects through time, but I know he talks about something like an abiding, unchanging self. Is that the self that we are? And is that empirical? I mean, are we an empirical self? And that's what's, obviously he's trying to say that has some kind of stability through temporal experiences, and that it gets that through this unity of consciousness. But yeah, I'm confused. Like, would that be me then, as in my empirical self, that is doing that? I guess that's a variation of the question of, is it individuated? Like, is that my identity, as in like personal identity?
Are you the same person you were 5 years ago?
I don't think I am a person. It's a personal question.
In a sense, you might say you're not the same person. You have witnessed within yourself change. This is all empirical. In a sense, you might say that you are the one who has witnessed this change in yourself. There is a constant self that is behind the changing self. That would be the transcendental subjectivity. If you recognize change in yourself, how is that possible if you don't have some stable self from which to view these changes? Sorry?
But every time you talk about like recognizing or being aware of, I mean, isn't that always empirical? So, like when I say, well, I realize that my body is a lot different now than or maybe when I realize that I have certain beliefs and so on that are very different from maybe, 20 years ago, but that is still an empirical observation. It's my empirical consciousness making an empirical observation. So what's transcendental about that?
What makes that empirical observation possible to begin with? Right, it all begins in experience, but it doesn't come from experience. You recognize a persistent self over change in your empirical consciousness. The ground of possibility for a stable self over change is the synthetic unity of a perception.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't seem to me like there's any firm stability in the empirical self, at least for me. I mean, it seems like it's something like a relatively slow changing thing, but it's kind of like, like when you say, well, that mountain's always been there. Well, I mean, it depends on what time scale you're talking about. And it's kind of the same thing when I say, well, I am this same empirical self that I was. I don't think so. And so I think, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. I mean, I think this is part of, Hume's point is that I think of my empirical self as my thinking of myself empirically, my consciousness of myself, of my mental states, of my memories, of this, of that. And none of that is unchanging. It's all changing. Maybe slowly, but it's all changing.
You introspect, you witness all of these changes within yourself. That's like seeing objects moving on a screen. You're watching a motion picture. The projector stays the same in the same position. The screen stays in the same position. The images change. If there was no screen and no projector, are you watching a movie?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's possible that the observer, that there is no stable empirical observer, that the observer also is part of the process that is changing empirically. Now, I mean, that doesn't throw out the need for, I don't think, for a transcendental ground for even be able to recognize that, but that I'm not convinced that there is an empirical stable self.
Yeah, why would there be? The empirical
Well,
self.
I thought that's what you were saying when you.
No.
I thought the projector was you were saying like there is some sort of empirical stability there that is able to recognize all the changing stuff.
That which is empirical is subject to causation.
So the projector is transcendental subjectivity.
It would be that single lens, a lens through which all of these images flow.
Just the lens.
Well, I'm trying to reach for an analogy of something singular and stable that allows for change.
Well, the reason I say just the lens is because it doesn't really have any content. I mean, well,
that's right.
Yeah.
Right. It's purely it's only the mindness that holds together all the content. It's the form.
Yeah.
Holding all of it
The
together.
form is
It's not the matter.
Yeah,
It's not the matter of experience. It is purely the form that holds the matter together as my experience. Right? I experienced the world yesterday, I experienced the world today, and I still think that I'm the same person yesterday as today. Right? Because I think I'm having a continuous experience. I recognize change in myself, but I think I'm a, you know what I mean? There's a me that changes.
So that would be the transcendental consciousness.
Right.
What you're talking about, Eric?
Like this, it would be an abstraction, a pure I. You think about yourself and then you take away everything empirical. You take away all the matter until you're left with just form. And the form is what brings everything together into a unity.
Yeah. Yeah, I just keep reading at this paragraph in page 165, the footnote. Yeah, I think that would explain it, what you're saying. So the way I see it, by using the Nevitz analogy, is like everything empirical would be all the images that hit on from a projector that hit on a screen. The screen that is white is the transcendental consciousness, and all the images that change is what is empirical.
Well, I was just listening to all talk. I was just thinking, I mean, and I thought Eric touched on this, and that is if I say I'm not the same person I was 6 years ago, I still must have some kind of reference to be able to say that. And so right? And so what is that reference? And if I can do that and say, well, I'm not the same person I was when I was 5, or well, okay, what's that other me or other me's? I mean, there's still some sense of continuity that I can say I am not the same person. There's still an I there.
I mean, the way Kant describes what experience might be like if there was no synthetic, I mean, it wouldn't be experience. It would just be, it would be intuition of, representations without any cogitation, any thinking or any proper experience of objects. It would just be, we receive intuitions and that's it. We don't hold them together. There's no coherent experience. We don't recognize objects. I want to say one of Beckett's novels experimentally tries to set up a protagonist subject without a synthetic unity holding it all together. And it's disorienting. Like, what the hell is going on? You know what I mean? What is going on with this character? Like, is it even You know what I mean? Is he aware of himself and what he's doing right now?
You know, again, and like I said last week, I think of, I mean, I don't know if he intended this directly aimed at Hume, but you know, when you know, like if you think about the way Hume describes experience, I have an impression. Okay, I have an impression of my bottle, and then that impression turns into an idea. And the impression the impression is transitory, but the idea is relatively stable because it goes into the memory. But I imagine Hume saying, or Kant saying, you've missed a few steps in that process. Why are you even able to experience the bottle as an impression? The very fact, why isn't it just like, I mean, if it was just a bunch of perception, a stream of perceptions, I'm not sure what it would be, like a black patch of color on a white patch of color with some sort of shape, and it would it would just be a bunch of sensory stuff, but I don't have an impression of, or the reason I have an impression of a bottle is because of these synthetic processes. And I think that I mean, I'm kind of sympathetic to that. When Hume says I have an impression of a bottle, I'm like, seems like there's a whole lot of assumptions built into that description. Which again, I don't think Kant's being super critical. I think he's just like, probably he's like then analyzing that and going, I don't think that catches the whole process.
Yeah, in a sense, he agrees with Hume, and in a sense, he disagrees with Hume. But I mean, he's very laudatory. If not for this guy, I wouldn't be doing this stuff. You know what I mean? I mean, Locke made some mistakes too, which set up Hume, which set up me. You know what I mean? Like it's a long conversation, right? He kind of recognizes that in some sense he is standing on the shoulders of those who came before.
Mm. I mean, I guess, Chase's question there about, or are you asking why can't you have an empirical ground of unity? Why do you need a transcendental one?
Well, kind of. I mean, I agree with your description of, which I think is also somewhat like Kant's and Hume's, that there's nothing empirical that is the self that you can point to that is an identity abiding through time. That's so then how can we talk about an empirical self at all? I mean, where's that coming from? Where's that? So obviously, I think Kant is trying to mesh these two together. I mean, that's really what the Transcendental is all about, is conditioning of experience. But it seems like if you say that there's nothing in the empirical for a self and it's all like this transcendental condition, then how can you talk about an empirical self or even consciousness at all? It seems like there would be no way of having a kind of constitution of something abiding in experience if it's all given transcendentally. So I'm confused about where exactly this operation is taking place in terms of, especially with the split between empirical and transcendental. And then also, if the individuation aspect comes from the empirical, the particular, then wouldn't the self have to be grounded empirically to that extent that it's individuated? Because if the transcendental aspect isn't, then I don't know. I feel like I keep asking the same question, but that's because I'm confused about how this exactly works in terms of um, what we think of as our self. I don't know. Does that resonate with anyone else?
It kind of proceeding from the assumption that we have a stable consciousness of ourself over change. that begs for an explanation in the wake of Hume. In the same way that he's also proceeding from the assumption that we can take nature to behave according to, behave lawfully, which is also under challenge in the wake of Hume. So he's really like, he's not trying to give an ontology, right? He's trying to answer Hume, right? If these things that Hume said we can't account for, perhaps we can account for, not in experience, but as a condition that makes that experience possible to even begin with.
So just like a common sensation of being a identity that lasts through time is correct.
I mean, do you experience yourself as a self that's the same self as you were yesterday?
I do in some sense not. I mean,
Yeah.
Okay,
Like
because the empirical self is subject to change, but what is it that changes? Is it the you that changes? Is there a you that changes over time?
Yeah, and I can recognize those changes.
Right,
More or less.
the way and I could be wrong, Eric, tell me if I'm wrong. Well, the way I think of the empirical self is that I think of it as like when I say I am Nevitt, it's what that I refers to. And I think of it as a concept that I have constructed over the course of my life. That it's and I have constructed that concept partially unconsciously, partially consciously by doing things like I observe how people interact with me. And so based on that observation, I just sort of in the background, I'm making inferences about what kind of person I am. And then I make choices and I do things and I reflect on that. And that over time, this concept begins to gel very early in life of Nevid is this person. So it's both, I'm literally reflecting on when I say, if someone said, describe yourself, well, I would be describing this concept I have of me. I think of that as my empirical self as a concept. And then maybe it's because I've spent too much time in meditation reading weird books, but when I sit and try to like literally sit and find anything like a stable self, I don't find anything. I do find that I am aware of a body that is, changes very slowly, and I'm aware of certain mental states that move and change, but I don't experience any entity, I don't experience any real stability. It's sort of a what's the word, inertia. I experience something that's just sort of shifting and moving, a wad of feelings and so on.
You're right. You're not going to. So, is there a continuity between the self that you're describing? Let's say 4 years ago, you were engaged in some meditation and you were looking for some stable self in experience. You're telling me that now, that was you, and the same you is telling me, right? You were doing this, you didn't find anything. Now you're telling me that you did this in the past and you didn't find anything. How is it the same you that is now telling me that you did this in the past and you didn't find anything? What holds that you together with this you that is reporting it right now?
So that would be the transcendental subjectivity. So what you're saying.
Yeah, right. That would be, the pure I.
Yeah. So the way so Devin, I have a very similar experience of basically that sounds like a better like phenomenological description of the self to me is something like you construct a concept to basically appease people because there's a social obligation to be a person that people can refer to and use in grammatical formations of I and you and all that. And then I think the constant thing is basically like a sense of alienation between that conceptual construction of myself that I constantly have to refer to and use in this way that's socially obligating. It has, lots of the historical sedimentation of power structures involved with it, mainly like the whole Christian thing of you have to be one self, one soul, and you die. That's what goes to hell. You probably, maybe heaven, probably not. Um, so I experienced like a constant alienation in those terms. That's the only thing I would say is like, oh, that's the same thing that kind of goes along with the experience years ago and my experience now of the self is the sense that there's like very bad constructions of it that I'm forced to undergo and that correspond with um, something like the grammatical form of the personal pronoun. So I don't know. Maybe that's also because I've been like snorting Zen for decades and
That's all empirical, though.
reading weird books and yeah.
The self that is ground down by the capitalist society is an empirical self. The self that is subject to causation, the self that is alienated for the world, a production for the world, a show for the world, a mask for the world, is not what he's talking about here. That holds all of our experience. It's a purely logical function. It's not a, you know what I mean? As soon as you start giving descriptors and you're moving away from the logical function, holding everything together as one, right? The I holds together everything as one. Now, I, as a capitalist subject, okay, now we start talking about an empirical self. And that
I like the idea of a capitalist subject. I think that's getting into something. Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think again that might be a little bit of what's kind of going on here, right? I mean, there is a little bit of an issue in Kant scholarship with exactly how do we relate the transcendental self, a transcendental right sense of self, and the empirical sense of self. But it really becomes more of an issue in the second critique. In the first critique, it's not quite such an issue.
Yeah, that's what is I linked the Nick Land essay or an audiobook version of it where he makes that argument that Kant's critical philosophy is basically like kind of reformulating the whole kind of capitalist notion of or the capital formation of, you know, a commodity form of general exchange that things can enter into and things like that. He makes a case about it for all the critiques.
He's not original in that regard.
Yeah.
This is Frankfurt School stuff too, man. Like Kant and Hegel are high expressions, highly developed and relevant expressions of bourgeois ideology, which is the world we live in today, which is something we have to reckon with. You don't write it off just because it's bourgeois. And at the same time, Kant and Hegel represent revolutionary bourgeois ideology. So if you care to change things, then you can focus on what's revolutionary about what Kant and Hegel are doing here. But also, if you feel alienated under this social order, you'll recognize in Kant and Hegel some kind of ideological expressions of that alienation. So there's obviously room to critique, right? But I'm just saying that this kind of split between the transcendental and the empirical self is more of an issue with regards to our activity, our moral activity, and our capacity for moral activity. Right here at the level of how understanding is even possible, how we have experiences of the world as a unified kind of, thing that I recognize when I get in my car, and then 3 seconds later when I kick on the engine, that I'm still in the same car and I'm still have a plan to go someplace. That my consciousness doesn't refresh every split second from zero to what I am now, from zero to what I am now, from zero to what I am now. Right? It continues. It holds all of these impressions together.
Yeah, I think maybe this what Chase is talking about, this sense of alienation would, even if it would, it's maybe it's something tied to the way that we are. I mean, Heidegger says that it is anyway, that it's uncanny once you realize what this existential death is, and it kind of colors your experience in a particular way, and then it just becomes uncanny, like we don't, like kind of like we don't belong here. So I think that's more of an existential, empirical feeling that arises from the type of being that we are. Um, but yeah, there has to be something holding all of these experiences together to give me a sense of continuity that when I get up and walk into my living room is still there and looks the same.
I've had these weird experiences where you know how you've had the experience when you say a word over and over and over too many times and it stops making sense after a while. I've had these. I'll have these probably again because of the weird shit I've done. But I've had these experiences where suddenly the notion of Nevitt research just ceases to have any meaning, and it's just. I mean, it's freaking weird. It's just. It's like I don't know. And maybe it's just completely psychopathic. Um, what's the word? Dissociation. But there's this weird sense in which my identity kind of like I become aware of myself, but as almost as a stranger, as something other than me. But then, you know, like you'd say, in order for there to be anything to be aware of that, there is some ground of awareness there even.
Right, right. And I mean, that happens to me all the time. Like, oh, I'm in school to be a philosopher. Like, what the fuck does that mean? You know? Or, like I'm, it's just whatever. It carries like a weight of importance, and this is all Heidegger, right? Like,
Mhm.
uh, being Dasemann versus abstracting away from. That's when it feels uncanny. When you're like, whoa, this is weird.
Speaking of uncanny doubles and the split in the subject, why are there two hunters?
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering about that too.
It's an
Uncanny.
alter ego. That's a transcendental hunter.
That's
Yeah.
yeah, it is kind of
That's transcendental. We cannot see it. Can only experience the other one.
Hunter Hewlett? This is getting uncanny. Yeah.
outside the boundary.
Where did Nevin go?
He's talking to someone, but I'm not sure who.
Yeah.
Eric's gone too now.
I'm currently in the
All right,
library.
who's next? They're dropping like flies. Oh, oh
I
no.
I think all three of them will come back, Chase. Don't worry.
Doggy. So in order for that dog to be the same dog 5 minutes ago, that requires
Well,
the
just as an, I'm sorry, go ahead.
intentional object,
Well,
which
but what about this, Chase? What about you were talking about the dog, but how would an observer of the dog and the dog's living in your house, how would the person observing the dog observe any changes in the dog? I'm not talking about changes of age. You know, the dog is now 9 years old, not 2 years old, but anything about the dog's personality, how the dog interacts. I mean, we can still, in the same way, right? We can say, well, that's the same dog that I had when he was a year and a half old. And we don't question being able to say that. At the same time, we say, the dog I have now is still the dog I had then, but obviously my dog has changed. Right? We were able to keep both of the senses of our pet dog in our mind at the same time, and they're
yeah,
not
so that's the
contradictory.
synthesis of reproduction.
I don't
Uh,
know what that means.
so in order for us to have that the ability to have recognition of things through time, which would be the third synthesis. That's grounded on the second synthesis, which is that we need the ability to be able to bring representations from the past into the present and
that would be
compare
memory.
them.
That's memory. Yeah, he
That
calls
would be
it
memory.
reproduction of imagination by imagination. This is what we were talking last week. Yeah. That is memory. He even says that this is memory, but he wants to call it in a different way.
What's the deal with his couple mentions of experience as nature? I got a
Oh,
little confused there.
wait, experience? Oh, are you saying? Oh, so
Nature.
well, yeah, his whole thing about nature is interesting. I guess. But yes, the idea is that okay, so nature doesn't exactly mean like trees and stuff. This is a an older, this is what nature meant for a lot of people in the, I mean, Kant's way of thinking about it, not our modern way of thinking about it, where like nature means like the trees outside and animals. Not for Kant. Instead, it's about lawfulness. Basically, the the necessary laws of nature. That's really what nature is.
But also
And
it could be
that's
reality that follows laws, because he says nature is merely a multitude of the mind's presentations. Page 8, 114.
Right,
yeah.
that's where I'm wondering where my question is, because it seems like
It's like
maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it seems like he's saying that we're nature also.
So
Sure.
we supply the laws that are
yeah.
nature. Yeah, so I think at least he may not want to say that we are nature exactly, but we definitely, so the understanding as the faculty of rules provides the rules that constitutes the rules of nature. So I guess you might as well say, yeah, we are nature, but I think that also involves um at least the understanding that what's going on with that is like, okay, he's talking about these rules of all appearances. So another way, he also defines nature as the sum of all appearances that follow in this necessary law-like connection. So I think because of that, you can't really exactly say that you are all appearances. So I think that's where he want to have some kind of more subtle distinction in that sense. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, so now I'm wondering, does that mean that the transcendental uh, apperception is what structures nature for us, but then at the same time, this like empirical self is in experience and is structured by the transcendental apperception. So is my empirical self then nature?
I would think of it as part of nature, but not all of nature.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So I mean, I think I want to say where a lot of people run into confusion is that in 2025, we tend to regard nature as that which is not human, right? Natural as opposed to artificial. And
Yeah,
this,
nature culture
Cultural,
distinction, which
yeah.
is like
right,
that's what
right.
anthropology is all about. Yeah.
And yeah, this is not even, this does not jive with
Yeah,
Kant.
it's more like reality or something like that.
Right, that's right. That's right. The lawful, all of our appearances that behave lawfully, right, according to the laws of nature that we understand.
It's the universe, basically.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The lawfully governed cosmos.
Yeah. The sum of all appearances that are
Yeah.
in lawful connection with each other.
That's right. That's right. And we can only speak of them as being lawfully connected as appearances for us. We can't speak of them as being lawfully connected as things in themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most one of the clearest, at least for me, clearest examples or something of the Copernican shift, because I think conventional experience. I mean, if you ask people why are natural laws what they are, and people are going to say, well, because the natural world, uh, absent human beings, the natural world has certain physical laws built into the natural world, absent human cognition.
And there's necessity there?
What's that?
And there's necessity there?
Well, I think they say yes, but I think, again, this is a case where I think
My dad would agree with
scientists at
that. Yeah.
least are bad philosophers, because they will make these assertions without really understanding what the implications are. And then if you try to point to them, say, well, you have no direct experience of that world, they would even agree with that, because they accept that kind of model that Chase was talking about of the empirical consciousness, but being grounded in neural states. But the problem with that is that means your subjective consciousness has zero immediate contact with that supposed physical world that is supposedly lawful. And but that's the way that people think about it. There is the world out there, and the natural laws are functions of that world out there. And then we're just observers of it, but then that just generates all sorts of problems. And it's like Kant just swallowed that, or he just bit that bullet, and he's like, well, you're never going to get necessity that way. You're just not. The only way to get necessity is if you ground it in the structures of our experience, the fundamentals, a priori structures of our experience. So, but that's why I say that's like that is the Copernican shift, kind of on steroids. The lawfulness is not of the world out there; it's the way that transcendental consciousness structures experience for me. Yeah, and there are a lot of naive realists around today. I mean, I think most people are, but a lot of scientists are not naive realists.
Right. But that's insofar as not really engaged in the philosophy. You know what I mean? Like, again, a lot of this, what Kant is doing here is in response to problems that were raised in the tradition, and specifically Hume. So in order to answer Hume, we're going to do this transcendental account. And until you are ready to answer Hume, and until you're ready to see the challenge that Hume poses, and looking for a possible response to that, then I don't see, why you wouldn't be okay with some form of naive realism. But it's philosophy that brings us to disabuse ourselves of naive realism.
Ideally, unless
Right.
some analytics maybe.
Right. That's right, Chase.
I just smiled when you said ideally.
I wasn't actually meaning to be that clever. That was just a coincidence. Yeah. But yeah, that's so that's how my dad, who is a constant conceptual persona that I'm in dialogue with, who I think he also takes up a lot of my superego. Uh he he thinks exactly that. This whole idea of, yeah, there's the world out there, external, I was going to say appearances, but that's way too Kantian. Just external things, and those have inherently, absent of humans, necessary laws, and that's what scientific reality is, which is also just reality. And if you think otherwise, then you're non-contact with reality.
So there was a
and if
period
you
in
question
time.
it, you're just stupid, and like, why don't you get a real job?
So there would be a period in time where if you didn't countenance a substance like ether or phlogiston, you were just out of touch with reality, dude. Until scientists figured out otherwise, and then it's like, okay, in order to stay in touch with reality, you have to believe in phlogiston until scientists disprove phlogiston. That's how you maintain contact with reality.
Right.
So, like, keep up to date with the changing scientific account. Like that leads to issues, right? Why does it change? How does it change?
Yeah, but I don't know. it seems to me, and I don't know what your father does for a living, Chase, and I apologize because I know you've mentioned your father before. I apologize for not remembering. But when I look at people in physics, especially, think of the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty, there did seem to be a, it seemed like even if they never read Kant, never read this, there seems to be somehow a connection between Kant and some of the people in physics when they're talking about very definite limits on understanding, accepting light is both a wave and a photon. Even they even joked about it, right? On Monday, Wednesday, Friday, it's a wave. On Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, it's quanta, right? Photon. But also idea of the Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty and Schrodinger's cat in the box. I mean, it seemed that at least some very important people in physics on both sides of the Atlantic caught up to Kant in the 1930s and
They
beyond.
explicitly discuss Kant. Heisenberg explicitly discusses Kant. Mach
Oh, okay.
explicitly discuss. They acknowledge a debt. They have disagreements, right? They're
Yeah.
moving forward. They have different ideas, but they're largely continuing also certain key innovations of Kant.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that
Not
makes sense.
maybe not the whole Transcendental Idealist project, but the constructivism in
Yeah,
particular.
constructivism. In the Copenhagen school.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Heisenberg. I mean, he has a book like Physics and Philosophy, and right out the bat, he's like, Kant made this innovation, and we kind of have to like question some of the things that Kant said, but we're not going to go back before the Copernican turn to some kind of naive realism. We have to think about how we're going to do physics now.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and Bohr and Einstein argued for, well, until Einstein died, decades about foundational physics. Remember that?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I haven't tried to track this down to be sure, but I'm thinking, Maxwell, the guy who developed electromagnetic theory, had to have read Kant, and he has an illustration when he was trying to develop electromagnetic theory, he was struggling to find a metaphor. And the problem was exactly that you can interact with these forces, but you can never have direct empirical access. So, for example, if you take two magnets and you try to force the north poles together, you feel the empirical data are tensions in your muscles and your flesh and so on. You don't feel a field. And he didn't even, I mean, the field was actually one of, it was like the last metaphor he came up with. But he actually, one of his illustrations called the bell tower illustration, where he said, imagine you're in a bell tower and there's two ropes coming through the ceiling, through holes in the ceiling, but you don't know, you have no direct sight of what's in the bell tower. All you know is that when you pull this rope, there's this noise up there and this other rope pulls. And so you can measure the forces on the ropes and you can measure the intensity of the sound. And so you can construct a theory of what is in the bell tower and what it's doing. But it's always going to be a metaphor. It's going to be because you don't have any access to it. You just have to construct this image of what what is helpful for you to think about it based upon the empirical data you have access to, like the forces on these ropes and the intensity of the sound and so on. And I mean, it's very, I think, very Kantian way of thinking of you have no direct access to whatever the hell is also very Humean, I guess, but you have no direct access to what's going on out there. So you can make some sort of transcendental arguments about what would have to be the case for these sorts of things to be happening, but you can't tell me exactly what's up there. So and I don't know. Like I said, I haven't tracked it down, but I'm sure he had to have read Hume and Kant and those guys.
Honestly, it's not a stretch to say that Kant is a large part of the reason why Germany flowered in the long 19th.
the end of the strange thing is, again, the frustrations with scientists and engineers. They talk about these electromagnetic fields, like, well, yeah, there's these electromagnetic fields. I mean, and Maxwell was like, well, it's a nice analogy. It's a helpful analogy, and you can write mathematical equations that describe what happens when you throw things through these fields, but the field is an analogy. It's a picture in your mind that you use to talk about things that you have no direct access to. Yeah, reified consciousness. Maybe it's too late in the evening to ask for clarification, but it's probably a big can of worms. Or maybe this is another thing that's going to come back up later. But the productive imagination versus what's the other one?
Reproductive.
Reproductive.
Yeah.
I mean, reproductive. That's like when your mind is trying to construct a.
What Chase explained a moment ago, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
When you keep the same representation throughout time, I think you reproduce it throughout time.
That's the reproductive imagination.
That would be memory. But then the productive imagination, well, I guess the first time that the representation comes up in your mind, I guess.
Right. And it's that which gives us an initial object to begin with. The way I was thinking about it was like this, and I might have to think about it further to see how good this is, but Hegel makes a similar point, right? Like you take any object and it has a number of properties. These properties are accidental to each other, right? Like it's brown, it has a smell, it's semi-solid, and the fact that I attribute all of these different properties to one object and one object only requires a synthesis of the imagination, a productive synthesis of the imagination. And then when I see this object persist over time, now this productive is reproductive.
So the productive imagination is what produces an initial synthesis
of an object as an
object.
object, right? As a coherent object with different properties that are seemingly unrelated.
Okay.
Like you can hold up your water bottle, right? The color has nothing to do with the shape, has nothing to do with the material that the top is made out of, has not, you know what I mean? The weight. I mean, like, okay, maybe the material and the weight are related, right? There's relationships between these properties, and then there's properties that have no relationships whatsoever to each other. And yet you still hold it to be one object. How do you bring all those properties together into one object?
And then the relationship because he's focused on this a lot. I think Chase mentioned this last time, but the synthetic power of imagination, is that ultimately grounded also in transcendental apperception? Like, what's the relationship between? So is transcendental apperception the I don't know what the core of all these synthetic powers?
The way it's interpreted is that this transcendental apperception is what collects all of the reproductive or reproduced imaginations and creates the unity of identity of the consciousness.
And it's itself a synthetic unity, right? It's a synthetic unity of perception, which he'll get more explicit here in the B section when he's laying it out. But you're right, though. It as a synthetic unity is still the ground for the possibility for any productive or reproductive imagination of objects.
Yeah, so the imagination in the transcendental productive capacity, I think what it's doing is it's taking that unifying aspect of apperception, and then it's literally synthesizing that with the manifold of intuition in order to put them together and give you a unified experience.
Right. Yeah, intuition and categories, and we get an object that is both black and metal and this tall and all these different properties. Right. Which again, those aren't categories as such, right? I'm just, we can apply the categories and see an object that exists, an object that is unified is one water bottle among many in the world, but is a unitary, you know what I mean? Like we can still apply the categories as such, and bring it together as an object. But again, this is just an abstraction from our empirical consciousness of a water bottle.
Wait, where's the water bottle?
Usually when you mention it, he holds it up, but you know.
Sorry.
There we go.
Yeah, again, this is, I hope this comes back. Well, again, we just read section, or we've read the part or the first edition, so maybe those will come back up. But this is toward the end of this part, where he says actual experience consists in apprehension of appearances, their association, reproduction, and thirdly, their recognition. And then this third element, such experiences contain concepts which makes possible the formal unity of experience. Now, these bases of recognition of the manifold, insofar as they are concern merely the form of experience, are the categories. I thought that was really interesting, but there's so much packed into those few sentences. But I thought, you know, his connecting the categories with this third phase of experience. You know, you've got appearances, reproduction, and then recognition. And then the categories are active in this process of recognition. That's a process I would like to understand better. I mean, I can read that, but it seems like there's like a, you know, like 30 pages packed into those 2 or 3 sentences there. So is he going to talk more about reproduction and how the categories relate to that?
Yes.
Okay, good.
A lot.
Okay, well that's comforting, because I thought, well, that's interesting, and then but I didn't, like I said, there's just so much jammed in there. Seems like it really needs to be unpacked.
That's right. That's right. It's going to get a lot more involved, and we're going to get in the weeds with the schematism. But yeah, there's plenty more to come to clarify a lot of that. Exactly that.
Well, that's good.
Schematism, my favorite part.
Yeah, honestly, it's my least favorite part. But I was looking at it again earlier, and I was like, you know, it's not that bad. It gets a bad rap, but it's not that bad. There's some important stuff in here, right? So no need to be afraid. No need to be afraid.
I don't know. All this scary talk's got me scared of the schematism.
Yeah, I think it's got a bad rap. But if you set up nicely, if you're grasping most of what he's saying up to that point, then you're gonna follow it largely. You might lose a little bit of contact, but you're gonna be able to follow it largely.
And we're all going to be doing it together, so that will be helpful.
Yeah, we can comfort one another in our distress. Okay.
All right, please wait. So comfort me, please. I need it.
Yeah, you're reading philosophy, so you know, Nietzsche says most philosophers and artists and other people like that are natural masochists. And
Right.
one of my, I've quoted this before. One of my professors said, "I don't know why anybody does this because it is just so hard." So I'm sorry, but you're in for a life of suffering.
So if readers of philosophy are natural masochists, does that make the writers natural sadists?
Probably.
Franzia helps, right, Chase?
Say what?
Franzia.
Francia. Yeah, or PBR. Yeah.
Right. Oh, there you go. It's right there. Dang.
Ah. Yeah. I haven't done Franzi in a while. It's some old school stuff.
Yeah, I'm used to Hunter Jet with the PBR and you with the Franzia, and me shaking my head at both of you.
But
Well, Nevitt and I have nice beers.
But since Hunter's been in California, he's been drinking things like IPAs and stouts, and so he's like
Yeah, that's the influence of law school on he's becoming a legislator of nature.
I'm part of the debt elite. So, you know, while I drink them while I got them. That's kind of my thought.
one of these days he'll be able to taste a little IPA. And so, there's a touch of leather and iron, curiously. A touch of leather and a touch of iron here in this beer.
Well, Hunter, I know you mentioned something about a new debtor. You're part of a new debtor class, but I have a nephew-in-law. When he finally finished all of his medical training to be a doctor, his debt was $800,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. I told a
How's
friend
that
that,
going
my
now?
friend just broke out laughing. Like it was just inconceivable that someone could have, a person could have a debt of 800,000, but he's paid off almost half of it already.
Well, ironically,
After how many years?
It's only been 5 or 6.
wow.
If you help the bankers evict poor people, you'll make lots of money and you'll be able to pay off your loans. Just sell your soul, have no conscience, and eventually you'll be able to work through those student loans.
Damn, that's actually good career advice. Yeah.
Conscience gets in the way of making money.
For sure.
Yes, it does.
On that happy note, any last words of unwisdom or wisdom or
Just thanks to everybody. It was extraordinarily helpful tonight, as always.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Also
Good
love
to see everybody.
Hail Satan.
Stop it.
All right.